Now, how we measure inflation is also how we measure cost of living between places. So instead of picking a base year, you pick a base year and place pair. Usually we're talking about countries. So a year and country. And you use that for your index. And very often it'll either be, depending on how old the data is, they'll either be measuring things in 1970 US or 2000 US. And the unit of measurement will be called international dollars. Sometimes you also hear them called Gary Kamas dollars after the two economists that developed this, but international dollars. Translating everything into a cost of living, comparable to the United States. And the concept is called purchasing power parity. And because poorer countries tend to have lower PPP indices, the adjustment mostly reduces the gaps between countries. You'll hear about some hellhole that has a GDP of like $500 a year, GDP per capita, $500. A lot of people swallow those statistics without thinking about it. I've always thought there's no way there's actually countries that poor. My rent is $900. I cannot buy the idea that someone living in a shack in Botswana is actually that everything they consume, just the food alone that they eat over the course of a year, is worth less than my apartment. Well, that's another case of statistics lying because the firstly, remember we talked about how subsistence agriculture doesn't get counted in GDP. Countries like that don't tend to have effective governments capable of collecting the statistics at all. So a huge chunk of their economy is black market. And you also get this cost of living. If you don't look at PPP, then it doesn't mean anything. But to illustrate the kind of impact this has, we're going to look at the US. This is with regional pricing parity. So each state has its own cost of living index calculated. Now, on this graph, it shades from black for the poorest state through red, yellow, green, up to a dark green for the richest state. Now, when we look at just GDP per capita, you'll probably quickly notice some regional patterns. The South is poor, New England is rich, and the West Coast is rich. And then it kind of looks like the middle of the country. The West and Great Plains might be a little bit better off than the Midwest. Our richest state is Massachusetts, and our poorest state is Mississippi. Everyone say it with me now. Thank God for Mississippi. Now, what happens when we add in regional pricing parity? Well, some aspects of the pattern stay the same, but some of it changes notably. After doing regional pricing parity, we see that the South is still relatively poor, but it's not as poor as before. Some parts are still doing rather miserable. South Carolina, Appalachia, Mississippi. But some parts improve notably. Tennessee comes out looking a lot better. Oklahoma comes out looking a lot better. In the Northeast, well, several of these states are just as wealthy as before, but some of them aren't. Vermont, expensive place to live. Maine, very expensive. Rhode Island, expensive. Where it really makes a difference, though, is in the interior of the country and in the West Coast. Suddenly, the interior starts to look really good. South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa. You got these places that don't have very large incomes on paper. But when you consider how cheap it is to live there, they're wealthy. I have more graphs. I don't teach inequality in this class, but when you look at inequality, it gets even better because there's a lot of inequality in the North and in the West, but there's not much in the interior West. Wyoming is probably the best place in the country from standpoint of quality of life for the average person. And that West Coast, jeez, look at how bad it is. California goes from being a top tier state to being a mid tier state. California, let me put it this way. California becomes the equivalent of a Louisiana in terms of living standards. Oregon, poor. Nevada, poor. Washington, actually still wealthy, but not as wealthy as it was. And worst of all, this one is crazy. Hawaii goes from like the 10s to 20s range of richest states down to the very bottom. They're like number 2 next to Mississippi. Hawaii has this reputation for being a paradise, God knows why, but it's everything they buy has to be hauled in from across the Pacific Ocean. It's like a little third world banana republic stapled onto the US. And that's more or less how it came to join us anyways. American fruit companies went in, couped the government, and then petitioned for annexation. It's a banana republic that we ate. If you're ever moving to someplace, I hope you have the good sense to look up the cost of living. Now, before concluding this section, there are a few other terms to introduce. Deflation refers to a decrease in the price level, negative inflation, basically. Yeah, and I already told you this was common under specie. Disinflation refers to a reduction in the inflation rate. You're going to hear that term a lot in the Keynesianism lectures. Uh, so deflation, the prices are going down. Disinflation, they're still going up. They're just not going up as fast. The inflation is slowing. It's starting to ease off. Hyperinflation refers to inflation occurring so rapidly that the currency breaks down, and seigniorage refers to the profits a money creator takes from inflation. So when inflation rates are predictable, people will account for that in their demand and supply. But sometimes governments get in a bind. They can't raise enough they can't raise enough taxes or borrow enough to stay afloat. And this is usually caused by war or revolution. Pretty much every time a country has a revolution, it winds up hyperinflating. It even happened to us when we had ours. There was an expression, not worth a continental, in reference to how worthless the US dollar was. And what the government does is it resorts to seigniorage, creating the funds out of thin air. Now, I already told you how, yeah, fiat currency, as we know it, was created by the World Wars. If I can't steal money from people directly, I'm just going to make more money and steal from them in that way. And one way you might think of it is if you have if money acts as like points to make a claim on society's resources, if I have 10% of the money in the world, I can claim 10% of society's value. What inflating does for the government is it just increases their share. It doesn't make the pie any bigger, but it gives them a larger slice by cutting down on everyone else's. And they're going to be able to spend the money before the prices have even gone up. So it's especially attractive to them. So you're in a situation, war, revolution, scary plague running amok, and you decide to just start printing cash. If you do this to repay debts, it's called monetizing the debt, which is an especially dirty deed. You owe somebody money, so you give them payment, but your payment cheapens the value of the very money you gave them, so you've effectively cheated that person. But it creates a vicious cycle because the inflation caused by the seigniorage means the government has to print even more next time, right? You do this once. The only reason you did this, the only reason you really want to do seigniorage is because you can't collect enough money to fund your government. You do it, you fund your government for a period. Now it's more expensive to fund the government in the future, which means you have to resort to even more inflation. And it just spirals out of control. If it's bad enough, if a government fails to put the brakes on it in time, it spirals out of control as they're forced to print ever escalating amounts of money. And if the inflation rate is high enough, the currency becomes impractical as a store of value. You get a paycheck and it's worthless by the very next day. And if the amount of currency needed is also large enough, then it's going to be impractical as a means of exchange. You might have heard the story about Weimar Germany. This was Germany between the world wars. They had lost World War I, and the Allies put very punitive reparations on them. They were expected to pay for everyone else's bills. And the Germans, they hadn't put any plan into how they were going to fund the war anyways. They actually intended to do the exact same thing to the Allies. And they never planned to comply with this in the first place. So what did the Germans do? Print money. Print and print and print. And eventually it reached a point that people were literally having to lug around entire wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy groceries. A reading from Lords of Finance, The Bankers Who Broke the World. On November 12th, the Reichsmark was trading at 630 billion to the dollar. Some argued that the rate of conversion should be fixed at that point, but shocked, the German central bank director decided to wait. The black market price was still falling, and he wished to allow the selling to exhaust itself before he committed to a rate of conversion. Every day the Reichsmark plunged further, and every day he insisted on holding back. On November 14, when it fell to 1.3 trillion, he did nothing. A day later, it was at 2.5 trillion, and still he sat on his hands. Finally, on November 20th, when the Reichsmark stood, if that is the word, at 4.2 trillion to the dollar, he fixed the conversion rate at 1 trillion Reichsmarks to a Rentenmark. From 630 billion to a dollar to 4.2 trillion to a dollar in 7 days. Imagine, loosely speaking, right? I'm estimating. Imagine having the value of your savings be cut to 1/8 in a week. 1/8 in a week. There's all kinds of crazy stories from out of Weimar Germany. And there have been a ton of nations over the years that have hyperinflated. You've probably heard of billion-dollar bills from Zimbabwe. You've probably heard of similar, excesses in Venezuela. One story I heard of Weimar Germany out of that same book had to do with the American expatriates who got stuck in Germany. I don't remember why they were stuck. The Nazis weren't in power yet, so it wasn't that. But so some of these American tourists end up getting stranded, and they're there right as the hyperinflation begins to take off, right as the currency begins to break down. And when a currency breaks down like that, Everybody wants to exchange it for a currency that isn't in a free fall. You know that if you save your money, it's going to be worthless the next day. You're going to be this poor sucker. So you had better exchange it for something else as soon as you can. You need to invest it in something that's going to keep its value. And oftentimes that something is another nation's currency. And so Americans who were holding American dollars, they had a field day with it. There's stories of regular Americans, the kind of people who nowadays would be like walking on foot from hostel to hostel, uh, renting out entire symphony orchestras to do private performances for them for the price of what would have bought dinner back home, because the currency was breaking down that much. People were that desperate to get their hands on American dollars that they would pay any price for it. There's tales of workers gathering together when it was payday, and the prices had escalated so much, and with it the wages had gone up so much that people were actually throwing employers were throwing sacks full of cash down to them as their pay. They're not even measuring it, because there's no point in measuring it. It wouldn't matter if there was a million mark bill in that bag, because it's going to be worthless by the next day anyways. So they're just stuffing sacks. They're measuring it by the sack, and the boss would throw it down to the workers from the second floor, and then the workers would solemnly run off to the store as fast as they can to spend it as fast as they can, so that they don't have to run back and get another sack because the prices have gone up again. There's a sort of insanity to hyperinflation. Even though economics likes to take this rational view of people, I don't see any rationality in that kind of behavior. People are set in their ways. Remember, the value of any currency, as we discussed, the value of any currency, but especially fiat currency, depends on faith. And that means that a currency can break down spectacularly when people stop believing in it. But people can also believe in something long after it deserves to be believed in. You'd think that those fellows with the sacks of cash would have just given up on it and taken their payment in something else. Pay me bread. But people are set in their habits. They'll cling to the institutions of life long after they make sense. Any currency can be hyperinflated. We talked about Mansa Musa's Hajj, hyperinflating gold. It can happen with anything, but fiat currency specifically is vulnerable to it. With all of those other currencies, they are pegged to something real. Or in the case of cryptocurrency, there's no known way to just up and print up more of it. There's no way to counterfeit it. Fiat is dangerous because the only thing that stops a government from hyperinflating is it not wanting to. And there's no magic formula that tells you when a thing will hyperinflate or when it has hyperinflated. People like to quibble about definitions. I avoid giving you formal definitions for this stuff because it doesn't matter. If prices on everything doubled over the course of 1 year, that would kill most people, even if it wasn't hyperinflation. If you were like 1 percentage point below the definition, it'd make no more difference to you than if you were 1 percentage point above it. What makes it hyperinflation is qualitative. It's that situation where the function of the currency no longer works. The currency can't do its job. People don't trust the currency anymore. And so they no longer value it. People don't accept it as payment. People make kites out of money. They wallpaper their houses with money. They use money as toilet paper because the money is doomed. It's lost so much value that it's never coming back. And usually people will then switch to some sort of spontaneous commodity currency. Because you can't run a modern society on barter. And people are very good at, it's called spontaneous order. Even without active government intervention, people are very good at creating new social conventions and new institutions all on their own. Usually the new commodity currency is either going to be liquor or it's going to be some kind of food stuff for the reasons we discussed back in the currency lectures. But it always happens. People always find a way. But it can cause a lot of damage in the short term. Now, what keeps inflation in check? Well, for the money issuer, seigniorage is like another type of taxation. If you're constantly inflating, then prices are always being driven up, and the government is constantly earning seigniorage. And as long as we, keep using this tax metaphor, and it is like a tax because you know that you're not going to reap the full benefit of your work if some of that's going to get stolen from you in the form of inflation. Well, then there's going to be a Laffer curve for seigniorage profits. The government's going to understand that if they raise inflation too much, that it acts as a disincentive to work, then it might actually lower their take. And the government also understands that if they hyperinflate, their own currency will be worthless. They'll have killed the golden goose. Once you've done it once, it's really hard to get people to trust you again. Brazil had an ordeal with that recently. They had to do this very gradual rollout of a new currency because they had to demonstrate to their own people that they weren't going to hyperinflate it again. And that's hard to do when people won't take your new currency seriously because you have to fund your government somehow. But in general, hyperinflation is a last resort of a failing government. It's not something that governments want to do. It's something that they have to do when they've put themselves in an unwinnable situation. So in conclusion, inflation is an increase in the general price level caused by an increase in the money supply relative to real output. It's measured by tracking the change in price of a bundle of goods. Fractional reserve banking creates money by loaning out more than the bank reserves, with the rate at which it does so being called the money multiplier. And when it fails, because everyone wants to withdraw at once, it causes a bank run. There's a relationship between the money supply and GDP that the total spending level must equal the total amount of money in circulation. People can't spend if they don't have money. In the short run, inflation causes distortions by artificially raising demand, with sticky prices hurting workers because the prices of goods go up faster than incomes. Whereas in the long run, money is neutral because the real opportunity costs and consumption will change. We have this term hyperinflation for when inflation is so extreme that the currency ceases to be usable, and government profits from moderate inflation through seigniorage. Now, with the basics of inflation covered, Mayday, Mayday, 1, 2, 3. Now, with the basics of inflation covered, we can combine inflation with our old supply and demand model to get the Keynesian model of the business cycle. This is one of the most influential models of the business cycle, although it's not the only one. And the rest of the unit will deal with it, the predictions it makes, and the policy recommendations it makes for how the government can help to solve recessions and depressions. I'll see you in the next one. Now, with the basics of inflation covered, we can combine inflation with our old supply and demand model to get the Keynesian model of the business cycle. This is one of the most influential models of the business cycle, although it's not the only one. And the rest of the unit will deal with it, the predictions it makes, and the policy recommendations it makes for how the government can help to solve recessions and depressions. I'll see you in the next one.